Well, seeing how we're about 13 episodes into this series, I suppose I'm kinda obligated to review a gaming pasta at this point. It is by most accounts the worst of creepypasta's many infamous genres, and that distinction isn't made without justification. This subgenre is full of countless unoriginal, not scary, and downright embarrassing shit stains that really aren't worth acknowledging or reviewing. This can be drawn all the way back to some of the earliest examples of gaming creepypastas, most notably of these being, of course, Sonic.exe, which went on to inspire an entire generation of young storytellers to write perhaps the worst content on the internet before their 13th birthdays. However, today we won't be going over some shameless Sonic.exe knockoff. My fate has been spared of that damnation for like 4 or 5 more episodes, thankfully. Instead, we're going to be taking a look at a story suggested to me by user Trotsky, who I'm sure isn't associated with the Communist Party at all. That story is titled Toter's Maze, and I had never really heard of it before they suggested me to look at it. But, having read through it, yeah, this story definitely deserves to be looked at here. Without further ado, let's just get right into it. So our story begins with our nameless protagonist, who is a teaching assistant this time around, explaining that while his job doesn't have many advantages to it, that every once in a while an old teacher will quit or get fired and will leave behind a bunch of old and out-of-date technology. Nameless here has a bunch of old Macintoshes and disk drivers and all that junk which he enjoys tinkering with. He mentions while most people, namely me, won't get excited over old junk like this, that even the most technologically illiterate individuals would get excited over the countless old and obscure video games he manages to find on these systems, even ones that have never been archived online. Nameless then explains that recently an adjunct that had been working at the school for decades finally quit a few months ago, and since he was gone, all the old computers and shit he had were now ripe for the taking. Nameless says that he didn't really know the adjunct very well, and that he barely remembers his name. It's something like, "Get out of my brain!" Now, I'm gonna be honest with you guys, because we're friends here. The next few paragraphs of this story are like really boring. So I'm just going to give you the SparkNotes version of it for like 8 or so paragraphs. So one night after classes, Nameless sneaks into the adjunct's cramped broom closet of an office, and after trifling through his stuff he finds an old Dell with a floppy disk inside. Like a dragon hoarding a pile of gold, Nameless decides to add the floppy disk and tower to his collection, and after taking it home and turning it on, he notes that the graphics on the screen are green, which would have to have been done intentionally, because on a modern screen old graphics would just be in black and white, not this sickly green color. Anyway, he has no problem navigating the system until he realizes that there's a disc inserted in the tower. He hadn't noticed this back at the office because of plot convenience, or maybe it's because of magic. We'll get into that later though. He pops the deep red colored disc out, and on it, written in black marker, were the words, Toter's Maze. And that's 2 shots right there, I believe. Nameless is confused by the name on the disc, as he's pretty sure the adjunct's name wasn't Toter, but his curiosity gets the better of him and he decides to play the game. As he clicks on the game's file, for a split second his cursor turns into a spooky face, but he only sees it for a moment, before the screen turns black and the game's title screen appears. Green drippy text appears on the black screen, once again forming the words, Toter's Maze. And in the center of the O in Toter is a single red pixel, making the letter look like an evil eyeball. Intrigued, Nameless presses start. The title card fades to black, all except for the O and the glowing red dot, as text appears on screen. Are you sure? Y/N. Nameless's curiosity hits a new level as he ponders why the game would have such a screen, clearly not noticing the metric ton of red flags the game is throwing directly at his face. He continues forward, and the text fades out once again, with the red dot sticking around a tad longer than the rest, because spooky. Level 1 begins, and it's not much to write home about. Just a single corridor of green angular lines with a red dot on one end and a slightly smaller blue dot on the other. Nameless quickly figures out the controls, and after ramming into one of the walls for the lulz, he directs the red dot into the blue dot, with the latter fading away on contact. Level 2 is basically the same, no obstacles or anything noteworthy. The only real difference from the first level is that instead of fading away all at once, the blue dot slowly disintegrates line by line after being touched. Nameless notes that the disintegration animation looked far more fluid than the rest of the game. This cycle of monotony continues for another 7 levels, which thankfully, for the sake of me, the author decides not to describe in agonizing detail. He notes that at the end of each level, the blue dot would perish in a new unique way. Sometimes it even appeared to be split apart as if being hacked at with a sword. Things get interesting, theoretically at least, at level 10 when the stage that appears is different from the others. This time, the blue dot, instead of remaining motionless waiting for death like the rest, began to move away from the red dot as it got closer, as if it was running away, and appeared to hide beyond the green lines that acted as barriers before him. Nameless is stunned by this, but also weirdly determined to win the game. So he decides to slam the red dot against the green wall, which I swear to God is not innuendo, until it gave way. When the dots touched this time, the blue dot appeared to explode upon contact, coating the green wall surrounded in blue pixels. The level faded out, with the remains of the blue dot staying on screen even after the red dot disappeared. Nameless feels awful about killing a blue square on a screen, but there's no time to ponder about the ethics of killing small dots. Not in this video, at least. We have to start level 11. This level is different once again, with a more complicated layout, full of unnecessary spaces and liberal use of walls. Despite being a bunch of green lines on a screen, Nameless begins to feel uncomfortable as the layout seems oddly familiar. He quickly ends the level with the blue dot being drained of its color this time around, until all that was left was a gray husk. Anywho, Nameless starts freaking the fuck out over these funky little squares dying at his hands, when suddenly he realizes why the layout of the room looks so familiar. It looked identical to the layout of his stepfather's house. Oh no, I know where this is going. He begins to question how much longer he'll have to play this strange game before he desperately tries to turn off the game and or his computer, but it doesn't turn off because of spooky video game ghost magic or something. He also doesn't try to unplug it because he doubts it'll work and it'll probably just upset him, which, considering he's a total fucking pansy, completely checks out. The red dot on screen slowly begins to grow larger and larger until it completely encompasses the screen. Nameless tries to shut his eyes and look away, but seared into his vision is the image of the spooky ghost face he saw his cursor turn into before. That face is on screen now, and I will admit, it's a bit creepy to look at, but Nameless here spends like 7 sentences breaking down how horrific and terrible it is. Like, it's honestly not even that bad. Nameless looks back at the screen, and level 12 fades into view. Much like before, Nameless recognizes the layout of the map. It's the same as the computer science department at his school. Oh god, oh fuck. The blue dot appears to be aimlessly wandering around the department as the red dot lingers where the adjunct's office would have been. Nameless continues to panic, telling himself that it's just a game, when suddenly he gets a text message, which startles him because normally people don't talk to him. And now we get to the point where the story officially jumps the fucking shark, and man, does it stick the landing, because the text message is from his mom, telling him cryptically that his stepfather was murdered. That's right, boys, it's stay alive rules. If the blue dot dies in the game, it dies in real life. Nameless reels over the fact that he probably killed his stepdad through a demonic version of Oregon Trail, and asks himself who or why this happened, and for some unknown reason to me, never questions how this video game he is currently playing somehow killed his stepdad. Back to it though, after vomiting, Nameless looks up and realizes the blue dot in this level most likely represents a custodian going about cleaning things, and he decides to defy the game. He chucks his keyboard aside and mad dogs his computer screen, which is a really funny mental image you've handed to me, author, thank you. Anyway, the game is magic, so that clearly won't work, and a timer appears in the corner of the screen. This is something I'm going to cover later on in the review portion. And Nameless crumbles like a house of cards almost immediately, moving the red dot forward and directly into this little blue dude, who disintegrates like Thanos snapped him out of existence. Then the stage turned to water and fell from my eyes? Author, I know what you mean by this, but this part is so jarring and silly that I can't take it seriously at all. Nameless looks up and sees the next text on the screen, which reads, "Final level." Nameless feels relief for a moment, knowing he'll only have to murder one more person brutally before it was all over. He thinks the game might try to pull a big funny and make him kill a bunch of people or assassinate the president or something. But let's be real, you already know what's coming. The final stage is his apartment. Dun dun dun. Nemo stands up and looks around his room. He sees nothing but a faint red glow. He freezes up before turning back to his computer screen. The same spooky face covers the screen once again. Its weird mouth spreads wider and wider until the entire screen is black. And then Nemos's throat is slit. And then a spooky demon posts this on creepypasta.com or something. Like, even the Pocket had another paragraph after the death blow. Like, gives a little bit more leeway, right? So that was Toter's Maze, and it was pretty meh, honestly. I suppose it wasn't entirely awful. Like, at least it was coherent for the most part, but there's still a couple issues with it overall. So let's just start with the big one, shall we? Guys, I'm about to say something that sounds a little weird on paper, but bear with me, it'll make sense, I promise. Basically, this story is like the gaming pasta equivalent of Jeff the Killer 2015. Now, you may be wondering, how? This story isn't a remake, and these two stories have completely different plot lines and characters. How are they equivalent in any way? Well, young Kevin, or whatever your name is, shut the fuck up. I said I would explain. Anywho, you're right, these stories have completely different plots and are in completely different subgenres. However, that doesn't stop them from being similar. Both stories are attempts to create a more grounded storyline around the plot structure of a fairly generic tale from their respective subgenres by making them longer and, in theory, more realistic. And both stories have similar problems that stem from this attempt, namely, due to their greater lengths and flimsy attempts at being realistic. Both stories are really boring, especially towards the beginning. Toter's Maze's first third really drags, with dull paragraph after dull paragraph of build-up and exposition to get to the actual good part. Like, I know we can't just jump into 8-bit murder without any explanation, but 13 paragraphs explaining this dude's hobbies and the financial situation of a character who isn't even properly named is a bit overkill. It's made all the worse when you actually get to the game and you realize that this story isn't going to be scary. Much like Jeff the Killer 2015's good part, the actual game within this story is incredibly underwhelming and not very frightening, which makes the utter slog at the beginning even worse in hindsight because the effort put into reading it was rewarded with a broken Happy Meal toy. The only thing that's even somewhat unnerving about it is the supernatural aspect, but don't worry, we'll talk about that in a minute. Both stories also, despite having more grounded depictions of their scenarios, still happily indulge in the numerous tropes and cliches found in their genres. Jeff the Killer 2015 is fully aware of the tropes found in the shitty killer subgenre, and even occasionally pokes fun at them, but still indulges in the tropes like bloodthirsty one-note bullies, cartoonishly abusive parents, and overpowered protagonists. Toter's Maze is less cynical and seemingly less aware of the cliches found in the gaming pasta subgenre, but still happily partakes in them. It bashfully uses curiosity as an excuse for why the protagonist doesn't stop playing, and it enjoys having the nameless protagonist be horrified by pixels on a screen to a cartoonish extent. It uses more colors than red and black, but the author was damn sure that floppy disk was going to be blood colored and the writing would have been done in black marker. They even do the Sonic.exe thing where the spooky image pops up on screen for a brief second before disappearing. Thankfully, in this case, the author recognizes that you wouldn't be able to write an entire paragraph about a single image shown in a single frame, but that might make it worse, because the author is clearly aware of the cliche, and that it doesn't make sense, but uses it anyway. Both stories, despite their best efforts, fall face first into the bottomless pits that are the cliches of their subgenre. And because they are so much longer, and their scenes of suspense are much less eventful and spaced further apart, it leaves a very unsatisfying taste in the reader's mouth. Oh, it appears I forgot to mention the biggest cliche that Toter's Maze uses. I should probably talk about how silly it is that the game is omnipotent. So, this is a problem with a majority of video game creepypastas, and it kind of blends into other media-based pastas as well, like lost episode stories, but it's really bad here, to be honest. Basically, it's kind of hard to make a video game scary, or at least a story about a video game scary, because at the end of the day, it's just images on a screen. it can't really hurt you. And at any point, you can just pause the video game or turn it off. So writers of creepypastas have to work around that issue. Now, at the start of gaming pastas, it can simply be brushed off as curiosity. But when shit starts to hit the fan, they need something more. So they just give the game God mode. Essentially, the game is given the ability to just control everything. It can stop itself from being turned off, it can infect your mind with spooky pixel demons, and most hilariously in this case, it can summon a monster into the real world that can kill anyone anywhere. And how does it do this? Oh, you know how. Through the magic of if it didn't, the story would be much less eventful. The game is only given these weird, wacky abilities because if it wasn't, the story would essentially be over before the supposedly scary part could even begin. It's an easy and contrived way to brush away any criticism of why the author would be so scared or why they don't just stop playing. Because they can't, because the game is cursed or haunted or something. This story is slightly different from most in the subgenre, where the game being supernatural is actually a key plot point. The scares don't come from your favorite childhood character committing war crimes or killing their mom or something, but rather the scary bit is the game is actively killing people in real life. So there's a bit more of a point to it in this case. However, there's literally no explanation for why the game can do any of this. It's not said to be haunted or cursed or anything of the sort. It just kind of can. You're not supposed to question it, which, seeing how it's a key focus in the story, feels very hand-wavy. Listen, I know fear of the unknown is a thing. In horror, you don't have to explain everything in black and white. That make things less scary. But in this case, I feel like there should be a hint to something, right? Even a throwaway line or reference. But there's nothing. So the reader is left wondering how a game on a floppy disk can summon a monster in real life. With how grounded the rest of the story feels, the stuff with the game itself feels out of place and frankly really silly. Now with all that said, what are my thoughts on this story as a whole? Well, let's just jump right into my closing thoughts. So this story is, I don't know. It's not great. I'd even hesitate to call it good. But compared to the majority of the schlock I've covered in this series so far, I suppose it's a bit better than most. Like, from an objective standpoint, it's probably the best written story I've covered. The spelling is acceptable and there doesn't seem to be any egregious grammatical mistakes. The story is also probably the best I've looked at when it comes to making an atmosphere. Honestly, if it had stayed committed to being a grounded take and had ditched the supernatural elements, it could have maybe been acceptable. Unfortunately for Toter's Maze, though, it didn't stay grounded. This story flew off into the realm of unexplained supernatural rubbish with an evil reality warping game that can kill people through magic or something, and quickly devolved into a cliched-filled mess. And did so only after the reader had to slog through about 3 pages of nonsense, boring build-up. It's probably one of the better stories I've covered, but that isn't saying much now, is it? I gave it a 43%. Not as bad as the hodgepodge of set pieces that is The Pocket, but frankly I still wouldn't put it over The Cough, which is kind of embarrassing. I wish a pixel monster would drain my blood at this point though, for real. Anyway, thank you all for watching yet again. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you to Trotsky for the suggestion. It was interesting looking at a story from a genre I haven't dived into before, especially one that's not entirely awful. If you have a story you'd like me to take a look at, drop a suggestion down below in the comment section, or join my Discord and tell me about it there. Next episode, we return once again to Reddit for a story about the moon being mad or something. I don't know. Anyway, I'll see you guys next time.